see we have a full house again, which is wonderful. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce Rami Khouri. Rami is the director of the Assam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. He served as the editor-at-large of the Beirut-based Daily Star newspaper, and he spent 2001 and 2002, the academic year, as a Nieman Journalism Fellow at Harvard University, and was appointed a member of the Brookings Institute Task Force on U.S. Relations with the Islamic World. He was editor-in-chief of the Jordan Times for 7 years and has written for many newspapers, including the Financial Times, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post. Please join me in welcoming Rami Khouri.
Thank you very much, Farah. Thank you all for coming out. Usually when I get a good crowd like this comes out, there's usually free pizza for lunch, but I'm happy to have you all out here tonight and share some thoughts with you. There's so much going on in the Middle East and the Arab world, and involvement of Western countries, including the US military, again, in the fight against ISIS, that it's hard to know where to start in analyzing the condition of the Arab world and the trends and the developments. But I would first say that this is truly a historic moment. There's been many historic moments in the Middle East around World War I, around 1948, 1967, and the end of the Cold War. But this one, I think, is more significant than any of the previous historic moments and turning points in the region, because what is going on now, broadly speaking, across the entire region is a great reconfiguration of the fundamental mechanisms and relationships and structures of governance, statehood, and nationalism. And these are happening in to different degrees in different countries for different reasons. So Morocco and Libya and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Jordan and Syria, and they're all different in what's going on. But the underlying drivers of these issues and this process of slow transformation across the region, the underlying drivers are, I think, pretty similar. And essentially, there are 6 fundamental issues or phenomena that I believe are reconfiguring their relationships to one another. And these are the 6 phenomena or dynamics that need to find a natural relationship with each other to have stable, prosperous, productive, and decent societies or countries. And they are, as I can see them across the region, issues of identity and issues of community, issues of religion and ethnicity, issues of territoriality and statehood, and fundamentally, in the final analysis...
Excuse us.
Oops. The TV cameraman has spoken. There we go. I was going to do my Rubio trick, go and get the water and bring it back, but so territoriality and statehood. And then the 2 last issues are the real prizes of this process, if they are to be achieved, which are citizenship and good governance, and ultimately sovereignty and self-determination. Those are, each of these is a big sticker item, but these are the fundamental phenomena at play now in the region. And what makes this moment so different, and therefore, in my view, much more important historically than any of the previous moments of historic change in the region, is that this is the first time ever, and I mean ever, since human civilization started in this region about 9,000 years ago, it's the first time ever that these elements are in play according to the desires of ordinary citizens. It's the first time that you have a bottom-up process of change. It's not always peaceful, it's not always clear, it's not always stable. It's, as you can see, there's terrible wars and violence and killing. There's all kinds of bad things going on. But the fundamental underlying driver is that ordinary citizens, and there's 360 million of them in the Arab world, for the first time ever in modern history, or in ancient history, are actually taking action or just speaking out and just expressing themselves without fear, sometimes digitally on social media, sometimes on satellite TV, sometimes demonstrating in the streets, and sometimes, as we saw in a few countries, revolutions that overthrew old dictators. But for the first time, there is a widespread loss of fear, people willing and determined to speak out, to express their grievances and their concerns, and to slowly start to imagine and ultimately, hopefully, to achieve new configurations that bring together identity and community and ethnicity and territoriality and sovereignty and self-determination and citizenship and good governance. The only thing that's happened in the last 4 years of these uprisings and the consequences after them, the only thing that's happened so far that we can say for sure has happened is that we are witnessing the birth of Arab citizens. In other words, men and women who feel that they have rights as citizens, who feel that they have the right to exercise those rights, who are no longer afraid to articulate their grievances or their aspirations, and who feel that through their actions, peacefully, hopefully in most cases, but in some cases we've had violent transitions, but who feel that they genuinely can, through peaceful political action in the public political sphere, bring about a better society for themselves and their children, and a better Arab world in the future. That's the only real constant change that we can claim, we can say has actually happened across the board in most of the Arab countries. And this applies to every single one, without exception. The rich oil countries, the poor countries like Egypt or Morocco or Yemen, the middle-income countries like Lebanon or Jordan or Tunisia. Across the board, we have this birth of Arab citizenship. And it's very, very early stages. But what we also see across the board in many Arab countries in the last 4 years, and next month it'll be 4 years since Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire on December 17, 2010 in rural Tunisia and literally sparked the Arab uprisings. What we have across the region is a very wide range of, a very wide variety of outcomes. You have Iraq and Syria with their terrible wars, the birth of ISIS. You have the transition to democracy in Tunisia, which is the first one that broke through. The Egyptians, not sure if they want democracy or keep the army forever. They're going back and forth. And countries like Yemen and Libya, where there's intense tribal and ideological contestation going on. And then other countries like Kuwait, like Jordan, like Morocco, monarchies where citizens are agitating, expressing their desires and their aim, their hopes, without making revolutions, without calling for the overthrow of regimes, but asking for serious constitutional change. So there's a very wide range of outcomes. You also have active wars taking place in Syria and Libya and a few other places. You have continued foreign intervention in many different forms, not just people fighting against ISIS, but you have the Iranians sending troops and money and help to Syria. You have Hezbollah fighting in Syria. You have Saudi Arabia sending its troops to Bahrain. You have the UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia helping the Syrian rebels, or in recent cases fighting in Libya. So there's all kinds of foreign interventions, the Russians keeping the Syrians and the Syrian regime. So it's not just Western intervention, it's foreign intervention, and not just non-Arab, like Saudi Arabia, England, US, Iran, but also Arab countries for the first time openly intervening in other Arab countries militarily, economically, politically, in a much more explicit and open public manner. This is all going on at the same time. You have some states that are fraying at the edges or collapsing. You have continued political violence as an ordinary routine means of expression, including terrorism of all different sorts. You have massive flows of refugees, probably 8-9 million refugees now all across the region from different Arab countries. And you have other problems like drought, urban sprawl, significant environmental deterioration, water problems in many countries. So there's a whole range of really problematic issues that shape the Middle East and the Arab countries, especially today. And when we look at all of these things, then the question becomes, so is the Arab world dying and collapsing, or is it possibly in the early throes of a rebirth? And it may be not a rebirth, maybe it's the birth, the first time that Arab countries, and you can't really look at the whole Arab world because there's 22 different countries and they're very different, but you can talk about the Arab region, and maybe it's the first time, I believe it is, that Arab citizens are playing a role in defining their countries. Most of the Arab countries, well, in fact, all of them really, were created without the input of their own citizens. It was elites, whether local tribal elites or urban elites or hand-picked elites, hand-picked by European colonial powers, who basically created these countries and managed them for the last 80 or 90 years. And most of them in the 60s and 70s were taken over by military regimes, starting in Egypt in the early 50s and spreading across the region. So you had the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, you had the Ba'athist regime in Syria, you had Gaddafi in Libya, you had Zayn al-Abidin bin Ali in Tunis, you had Omar Hassan al-Bashir in Sudan, and on it goes. So you have Arab countries that for most of the last century were managed by militarily anchored families. And it's an unprecedented situation. Nowhere else in the world have we had, since the beginning of modern statehood, the whole region without a single democratic transition, which we did in South America and Africa and East Asia and Eastern Europe. No region in the world has remained, as an entire region, non-democratic, ruled by families, held together by security and military systems. And that's why these uprisings started to happen. There's three orders, really, that are collapsing when we look across the region and we look in historical terms. The first order is the order of World War I, where many of these countries were created, mostly created by often semi-drunken European diplomats, literally after dinner with liqueur drawing borders of countries. So the World War I order of countries has been fraying at the edges for some time. And that order is pretty much still fraying and in some cases collapsing. The second order is the post-World War II order, which was the Cold War, where you had external pressure from the Soviets and the Americans, the East and the West, keeping the lids on an entire region where, starting in the 50s, you had centrally controlled political and economic and social systems by governments that were not yet family governments like they became later, before Gaddafi and Assad and Saddam Hussein, but you had centrally controlled nationalist development states. The countries in the 50s and 60s and 70s were really focused on development and achieved some remarkable gains. Arab education, immunization of children, job creation, home construction. There was some tremendous advances that the Arab world made when you had governments that were focused on development and were infused with the spirit of nationalism, whether it was the building of their own states or the sense that people in the Arab world needed to work together for a common nationalist cause. And those states, the Arab nationalist, centralized nationalist development states, were successful for maybe 20 or 30 years from the early 50s to the mid-70s, late 70s. But that order is fraying as well and collapsing as well, because what happened is in the early 70s and mid-70s, we had the third order, which is now also fraying and collapsing, which is the order of which transformed the nationalist development state into a security consumer state. So starting in the 70s, when you had the families taking rule in Libya and Egypt and Iraq and Yemen and Tunisia and other places, you had family rule essentially, and the nationalist development trend gave way to a security trend. And this was made possible by the combination of the continued pressures from the superpowers that kept the lid on, and massive amounts of money that were going around the region because of the tremendous increase in oil income that was spread all around the region through development aid, investment, official transfers, labor remittances, and other means. So there was hundreds of billions of dollars that came to the oil producers that were in fact spreading around the region and helped keep the situation essentially politically frozen in all the Arab world. And individuals and governments then became purely focused on security, and that's when the security agencies and the militaries and sort of took control of these states with the families running them. And the citizens had basically one right, which was the right to be a consumer, to go and shop. And so the expansion of shopping malls, for instance, and private residential quarters and car dealerships, and the material side of life, the consumer side of life, has expanded rapidly in the last 30, 40 years, replacing the developmental legacy which had ruled in the previous 30 years. So all of these three orders, the post-World War I, the post-World War II, and the post-mid-1970s family-run security states, all three of them have essentially reached their limit and started to be challenged by their own people. They started to be challenged in the 70s and 80s in many ways, mostly by Muslim Brotherhood type groups, but also by leftist and progressive and nationalist groups. And the transition that happened from the post-World War II states to the security states in the 80s then led to a period of decline in the mid-1980s, because population growth in the Arab world way exceeded economic growth. And you started to get in the mid-1980s a slow pauperization of large quarters, large segments of people across the Arab world, where per capita income was either frozen or actually declined, where people who had jobs were not earning enough money to actually make a good living. Young people today in many Arab countries can't afford to get married because they don't have enough money, they don't have enough jobs, they can't possibly buy a house or rent a house in many cases. So the last 20 years or so, 25 years, has been a period of internal turbulence in the Arab world, which was speeded up by the end of the Cold War in 1990, which took away those clamps from outside. And we've seen in the last 20 years, 25 years, huge changes in the exercise of power and the emergence of many non-governmental organizations that essentially filled in the blanks and occupied the voids that were created when central governments found themselves slowly pulling back from different parts of society, either physically pulling back from parts of society where the central government could no longer provide the jobs and the services and the subsidized milk and the free education and the medical care that the governments had provided very well for the previous 50 years. Starting in the mid-1980s, governments couldn't do it. They just didn't have the money. And they started pulling out of areas, and Muslim Brothers and leftist groups and NGO groups and tribal groups and foreign aid groups and all kinds of private sector, all kinds of different people filled in those voids where the central government had retreated. And therefore, we reached the point in the year around in the 2000s, 2005, 2010, that period, when there was a significant rattling of the whole foundation structures of most of the Arab countries. None of them fully collapsed, but none of them were firmly in control of their entire territory. And issues of identity, issues of representation, even issues of sovereignty started to come into play in the last 10, 15 years. So you saw groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Palestine, Muqtada Sadr in Iran, the Houthis in Yemen, different groups like the Muslim Brothers in the peri-urban, poorer regions of Cairo. There was all kinds of different groups that started to play a role in society, replacing what the government used to do. So governments became much more vulnerable in the eyes of their own people. And when Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire in December 2010 and sparked this wave of demonstrations, which led to uprisings and revolutions, we've seen over the last 4 years an extraordinary outpouring of expressions of grievances by citizens across much of the Arab world. Not every country, but most of the countries of the Arab world, citizens were publicly and privately expressing their grievances for the first time, creating new situations of turbulence in which essentially the issues of identity and sovereignty and power and representation were up for grabs for the first time, where foreign powers were no longer keeping the lids on, central governments were no longer able to pacify and service everybody, and the pressures on ordinary families, economic pressures, housing, jobs, education, healthcare, water, in every aspect of life, except for the very wealthy oil-producing states where the government still had a lot of money and served their people well by providing them with their basic needs. In every other Arab country, there was significant internal stress, and this went on at the same time as the Arab-Israeli conflict continued to play its negative role in creating anger and frustration and humiliation and even radicalization across the Arab region. And the Muslim Brotherhood and people like Al-Qaeda played on this theme. It further reduced the legitimacy. First, it reduced the efficacy of the Arab governments in the eyes of their own people, and then started to eat away at the legitimacy of many of the Arab governments, which made it much easier for these uprisings to happen because people no longer, many people, not everybody, but many people no longer feared or respected their central governments because their central governments were not responding to their needs. And we saw what happened in the last 4 years with the different outcomes. And I would say by looking back over the last 4 years that what we can say is that a process of change has started, driven by the sentiments of ordinary people at the grassroots level, but has what started as peaceful demands for constitutional change and political change quickly developed into a demand to remove and overthrow regimes and then resulted in the pushback by some of those regimes in Bahrain, in Syria, in Libya. Gaddafi was fighting against his own people until he was overthrown. And the regimes started to push back hard, leaving situations of active warfare, as we still see in Syria today. But if we look back again on the 4 years across the region, broadly speaking, we can identify two, I think, main themes, and this is certainly what I see within the region. The first theme is the common demands across the region, and this includes every single country without exception, even the rich oil states. But in the rich oil states it's much less, the intensity is much less, but even in the oil states you get activists talking about some of these issues. But certainly in the poorer countries and the countries that had revolutions, the three common themes that we hear across the region are the demand for constitutional change, the demand for citizenship rights, and the demand for social justice. Those three are the common denominators of movements, social movements, political movements, citizen movements across the region, generally, sort of speaking in generalities. Those are the three issues that people are talking about and that people want to see happen. And in most countries, people are not asking to overthrow the regimes, they're asking the governments to do a better job as governments, to provide social justice, to provide constitutional rights, to allow citizens to participate, to have parliaments represent their people more accurately, to allow more freedom of speech. Only in one or two places did people actually overthrow the regime, but in most Arab countries, the people are not revolutionary, but they want constitutional change, they want citizenship rights, and they want social justice. So that's one common I think, assessment of what happened in the last 3.5, 4 years, and will continue to happen for some years. The second one, which is more complex, but I think very important to understand, is that what's going on in the Arab countries, and again, each one is different, but particularly in the countries like Yemen and Tunisia and Egypt and Syria, where there's a lot of action and a lot of violence on the ground, what's going on is that people, entire societies, are compressing or have compressed into 3.5 years, or almost 4 years next month, dynamics, historical, epic, nation-building dynamics that in this country took about 2 centuries. In other words, the elements of revolutionary, first of all, uprisings, like you had against the Boston Tea Party, no taxation without representation, uprisings, revolutionary wars, constitution writing. The first example of your constitution was a great embarrassment. It was a terrible failure. And so 10 years later, they had to come back and do it again. And fortunately, they learned from their mistakes and they came up with a better constitution the second time, which had to be amended many times. But that whole constitution writing process, which took years in your country, was done in 1 or 2 years in Tunisia, which is the first one to break through. And then you had the civil war, and we have civil wars going on in Syria and Libya and in Yemen, elements of civil wars. And then the massive social movements that you experience for women's rights, for black people's rights, for immigrant rights, for minority rights, for all the different social movements, labor rights, that were one of the defining features of the strengths of the United States, which went on for at least a century and are still going on today. Those were also compressed into the last 2-3 years in Arab countries. So if you follow the constitutional debate in Tunisia or in Egypt, they tried to agree on a national consensus on issues like the role of the military, the freedom of the press, the role of women, the role of Arabism, the role of minorities, the role of Islam, these really big sticker items that most countries, including most Western democracies, dealt with over centuries. Your great democratic example for the world with the American Revolution and your Declaration of Independence and the first Constitution was a ringing bell of freedom except for women who had no rights, black people who had no rights, most other minorities who had no rights. Only white men who owned land and slaves really had rights in the 1770s. But the strength of your democracy is that you filled in those gaps over the years. But it took you 150 years or so until 1965 when black people finally got the vote, for their full rights. So the compression into 3.5 years of historic, epic dynamics that took a century and a half or two in Western democracies is really one of the striking features of what's going on in the Arab world today. And one of the reasons that things are so complicated and often so violent is that no country in the world has ever tried to do what Tunisia just did, which is actually to achieve a consensus, write their own constitution. This is the first time ever that Arab citizens wrote their own constitution after 2 years of intense debate and significant discussions and then compromises, peaceful political compromises. And they passed, they validated the constitution, and now they're starting to implement it. So what we're getting at this point now in the Arab world, what we have is a situation where an unprecedented process of citizen-driven transformation is combining with an equally unprecedented process of external intervention. The Iranians, the Russians, the Americans, the British, the Saudis with sending their troops to Bahrain, with the Gulf countries sending their money to rebels, with the Qataris, with the UAE, with this incredible external intervention in other people's countries, combined with the continuing impact of the Arab-Israeli conflict, combined with active warfare that brings in external players, which is people fighting ISIS, which they should be fighting ISIS because ISIS is a terrible threat. So this is a situation that's very complex, will continue to be erratic and violent for some years, but is the early stage of what I believe is an unprecedented and ultimately will be a positive process, because several things are happening at the same time. First of all, ordinary citizens are expressing themselves, are speaking out. Second of all, despite the violence you see in Syria or ISIS or one or two other places, you still have in Libya, in Yemen, you still have people pushing for peaceful constitutional change. It's not reported very much in the American press. Well, that's a problem of the American press, not the problem of the Libyans or the Tunisians. You still have massive determination on the ground to try to fulfill the promise of the uprisings, which is to achieve citizenship, constitutional change, and social justice. And this is, again, unprecedented, and will succeed in some places and will not succeed in others, but these are still relatively early days. The last point, I need to stop in 3-4 minutes, so the last point I would make is about ISIS, because I would like to hear your comments and questions. And so ISIS is on everybody's mind, as it should be, because it's really a scary phenomenon, but it is totally anticipated, not at all surprising, and troubling in both its birth and in the current attempts to defeat it. And what I mean by that is that first of all, why it's not a surprise, why it's something that we shouldn't be surprised at. The birth of ISIS captures all of the problems that plagued the Arab countries, which I just mentioned briefly, with bad development policies, the militaries controlling countries, families running entire countries, corruption, abuse of power, large-scale pauperization, political marginalization and vulnerability, all of the problems that affected many of the Arab countries. Not every one of them is like that, but many of them. Certainly the non-oil producing poorer countries are almost all suffering from these issues. And people have tried since the 70s and 80s and 90s through different mechanisms, peaceful mechanisms, Muslim Brotherhood groups, progressive groups, human rights groups, democracy promotion groups, lawyers groups, rule of law. Many people have tried to address these issues, but got nowhere because the military-run family regimes controlled every aspect of life. And the emergence of ISIS reflects the seventh form of Islamist defined responses to the stresses and inequities and problems of the modern Arab world. And what I mean by that is if you go back to the 50s, you can start, well, the Muslim Brotherhood started in the 30s, but every reaction in society to try to address the grievances of people, including Israeli occupation and colonization, foreign military attacks like Iraq, American and British attack on Iraq and things, and the drones now that the US is still using to kill people all over the place. Every reaction to these grievances, whether domestic grievances, Arab-Israeli or foreign militarism, has always had a religious tinge to it, an Islamist tinge to it, because this is a region that's predominantly Muslim. You had the Muslim Brothers in the 50s and 60s. You had in the 70s fringe groups that broke away from the Muslim Brothers, and the Muslim Brothers were nonviolent and peaceful, but they were Muslim Brothers. They wanted to bring about a more Islamic society, but they were peaceful. In the 70s, you had these small violent groups, the Jama'ah Islamiyya in Egypt and in Syria, who were killing people, including Sadat and others. The third manifestation of Islamist-led, let's call it activism, was Al-Qaeda, which started in the 80s. And Al-Qaeda started not against the West, or not even against Arab governments initially, but against the Soviets in Afghanistan. And then later shifted towards Arab governments, and then later shifted towards the United States, because they saw that the US was supporting these Arab governments, and therefore they said, let's not waste time with these Arab governments, let's go get the real source of the problem, which is the US. But Al-Qaeda was the third form. And then you had, in the 80s, the birth of Hamas and Hezbollah in Palestine and Israel. Those groups were different from the others because they were national-based military resistance groups. Their aim was to fight the Israeli occupation, but also to deal with domestic stresses of corruption and bad government and things like that. So Hamas and Hezbollah were two other forms. And then you had the Salafists, who are the fundamentalist, peaceful, nonviolent Salafists. They're like Christian fundamentalists who, they go around talking about the Quran and how we should live a decent life and what God wants us to do. And they worked at the community level mostly. And then you had the emergence of the militant Salafists, people like Jund al-Sham and the Ansar al-Bayt al-Maqdis in northern Sinai, who were attacking the Egyptians, Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, and a whole bunch of small groups like that. And some of them started back in the 1990s and 2000s, and very small groups here and there, had no popular support. And then finally, now we have ISIS. And ISIS is the latest manifestation of this whole legacy of discontent that keeps breeding reactions from society that tend to be colored by religion, but none of them have been able to achieve anything. ISIS has very little support in the Arab world. Half of their members are non-Arabs. They come from other Pakistan and different countries. Many of them come from the West. But they were able to take control of parts of Syria and Iraq, and they have some land, they have resources, they have fighters, and they're a real problem because they're vicious killers who have almost no support. But what is it about ISIS that should trouble us? And the same thing about Al-Qaeda, is that these groups can only take root, operate and grow in zones of chaos, and those zones of chaos and ungovernability started to be created in a serious way in the Arab world after the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq in 2003. It was only in 2004, 2005 when Al-Qaeda sent Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, who was a Jordanian member of Qaeda, they sent him to Iraq to start fomenting sectarian tensions with the Shiites, which he did, and therefore the sectarian Shia-Sunni troubles started. I would give anybody in this room $100 if they can tell me about any Sunni Shiite problems before 2003 in the Arab world, because there were none. There was theological differences, and you had social, you know, the Shiites of Lebanon were, you know, took the poor jobs, and but there was no cutting people's heads off, there was no bombing mosques, there was no ethnic cleansing until 2003 in Iraq, because the American-British invasion wiped out the Iraqi state, which was an awful state in many ways. It was a good state in developmental terms. The Iraqis achieved amazing, they were exporting doctors, and there was an amazing developmental history, but an awful political regime, a police state. But when that whole state was removed by the orders of the Americans, Paul Bremer, it created complete chaos, and that's where Qaeda could go in. And Qaeda has only operated in zones of chaos. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, Mali, Libya, Iraq, and Syria after the war started. They cannot operate in a normal society because the people would throw them out. And now ISIS has taken on this new mantle, and my fear is that the strategy being used to defeat ISIS, and ISIS must be defeated, it's a terrible criminal organization, it must be defeated, but the problem I have is that the strategy being used to defeat ISIS reproduces the strategy that created ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which is the combination of Arab autocratic regimes with Western militarism. And that combination is what gave rise to not just Western militarism, but foreign militarism, if you take the Soviets in Afghanistan. But it was the American presence in Saudi Arabia after 1992, after the war to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. There was the long-term American presence in Saudi Arabia that caused the Qaeda to shift its action against the United States. So American or Western militarism with Arab autocracy is what gave rise to these radicalized young men. So it was really Arab jails and American jets that together provided the environment in which young men were radicalized very badly, and a few of them broke away and created Al-Qaeda and now ISIS. So I think we need to think much more carefully about using Western and foreign military actions to defeat ISIS. They can be contained in the short run, but if we still have the same combination of Arab autocrats with Western militarism, it's going to contain ISIS, but it's going to give birth to a whole new generation of something even worse, because that's what's happened every decade for the last 5 or 6 decades. So there are real problems around the region, and the Arab world is dying, and the 3 orders I mentioned are fraying, and in some cases dying. But there's also a new dynamic, a new birth, a citizen-driven desire to come up with something better. And it has only broken through in Tunisia. But the forces that gave birth to the Tunisian constitution will continue to drive tens of millions of people across Arab countries. And we just have to give it more time. Some countries will succeed, others will not. Like the former Soviet Union, when it collapsed, some countries became democratic, others remain terrible police states. And I think the same thing will happen in the Arab world. So I hope that gives you a picture of some of the hopeful issues and some of the real problems that we still have. Thank you very much. Should I use this? Yeah, this is right.
Thank you, Rami. This was very informative. We're doing a slightly different setup today. I wasn't informed before I put on a dress and couldn't do this, but anyways. As I wait for the questions, thank you, sorry.
This is just like the Arab world. I have to wait for the censor to give me the right things.
Yeah. So we have, first question, will Assad be able to remain in Syria, in your opinion?
No. I don't think he'll remain, but it's hard to know when he will go. I was surprised that he's been in power still now, but it's not surprising if you look at the amount of force that the Syrian government has used against its own people and the terrible destruction that has happened. So he's still president, but he's not really president of Syria. He is the leader of essentially a Alawite family militia, which is very big because it includes about 100,000 Syrian soldiers. So it's not really, he's not really the president of Syria. Syria now has 4 sovereign authorities: the government that controls about 1/3 of the country, the ISIS group that controls the northeast, the Kurds, and then the other opposition groups that include some centrist Islamists, let's call them, nationalist Islamists, as well as secularists.
And actually to that end, we had Josh Landis here, and he suggested dividing Syria into thirds. What's your view on that?
My view on that is it's really up to the Syrian people to decide what they feel is best, same as in Iraq. Iraq might split up. I think most of the Arab countries will probably maintain their existing frontiers. We did have one country already that broke up, which was Sudan, and that was done peacefully through a peaceful referendum, and South Sudan broke away and created its own little country, which is having a lot of troubles, but still it was a peaceful process. So self-determination is something that I really believe in, and I think if the Syrians decide to split up into 3 countries, then that's fine if they do it in a legitimate and credible way. I don't think it'll happen, but I think what's going to happen is what we've already seen in Iraq, which is severe decentralization, and you're seeing it probably happening in Yemen and almost certainly in Libya. But these countries could all fall apart like Yugoslavia did and break up into smaller ethnic-based statelets. I think that would be a big mistake, but we'll have to wait and see what the verdict is from the people themselves.
And you said in your presentation that Tunisia, with the exception of Tunisia, all the others have continued with their problems and troubles. Why do you think Tunisia, and in some respects Morocco as well, why do you think they've been more successful in accepting diversity than the other countries?
Morocco is too early to tell. You haven't had any major demonstrations. You've had a lot of small demonstrations in Morocco, but Morocco's always had a vibrant civil society, and they have different ways of expressing their grievances and non-violently. But it's still early days in Morocco. We'll have to see how the king responds. I think Tunisia succeeded for several reasons. They have a longer secular tradition. There is a kind of a clearer sense of national identity among Tunisians, even though you have Amazigh or Berbers who are not Arab, but they all, I think, the Tunisian people feel that they belong to Tunisia. There's 2 factors that I think were critically important. One is the nature of the Muslim Brotherhood opposition, the Nahda party, headed by Rashid Ghannouchi. The Nahda party was outlawed under Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, but they spent 20 years in Europe. They were in Geneva and Paris and London, and they learned a lot in their exile in Europe. They saw how pluralistic societies work. They saw how political compromise and democracy happened. The Egyptian Muslim Brothers were mostly in jail, and they were tortured and beaten up in jail. And there's about 20,000 people now in jail in Egypt, by the way, Muslim Brothers and leftists and young activists. And this is exactly what gave rise to Al-Qaeda. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, now the number 2 under bin Laden, was radicalized inside Egyptian jails. So we're seeing, but the Tunisian Islamists had a different experience, were much more willing to compromise, and during the transitions compromised several times, even when they were heading a coalition government. But the most important factor for Tunisia is there was a third party between the government and the citizens, which was the trade unions and civil society, who were able to both propose compromise solutions and help negotiate them and apply the political muscle that was needed. In other words, the trade unions has 1 million or more members. The Trade Unions Federation at one point told the Muslim Brothers and Nahda and the other groups that if they don't agree to a coalition government, they're going to bring out 1 million people in the streets and throw them out of office, like happened in Egypt. And that was real pressure that was supported by the vast majority of Tunisians. In other words, you had a third party that played a catalytic role and a mediating role and a pressuring role, which doesn't exist in any other Arab country.
Given the turmoil and change you've described, what difference would settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict make?
I think that resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict peacefully, equitably for Israelis and Palestinians and others, Syria has land occupied by Israel, but resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict would be the single most productive short-term development that would help create a better environment in the region for resolving the other issues. It's not a panacea that's going to solve everything, but the continuation of the Arab-Israeli conflict has been the greatest force of radicalization in the region and has been one of the major factors for delegitimizing many of the Arab regimes, because the Arab regimes proved totally unable to deal with Israel, either make peace or make war. Two made peace, Egypt and Jordan, but the problem wasn't in Egypt and Jordan, the problem was in Palestine. And the Arab regimes, the governments proved totally incapable of doing anything, and this reduced their legitimacy and the respect that people had for them in the eyes of their own people. So I think that this is a crucial factor, and if the United States and the Europeans could play a constructive role in mediating a resolution, which they haven't yet, that would be a huge boost for better relations between Europe and the US and the Arab countries.
Thank you. I think we've got time for maybe two more questions. You spoke of Western militarism combined with the autocratic Arab states.
Arab jails and Western jets.
I like that quote,
That's
actually.
Good.
Creating more terrorists, really. So really it's two questions. What would be your solution? And the second question, if that were to continue, this kind of response, do you think that ISIS will take over Iraq and Syria?
I definitely don't think ISIS is going to take over anything. They've pretty much reached the maximum of what they were able to do with no significant opposition at all. And they still haven't been really confronted. The air attacks have contained them a little bit and prevented them from expanding here and there, but they're still expanding in other parts of Syria and Iraq on the edges, but they don't have any real future. They have no popular support. They only rule by intimidation and by cutting people's heads off and intimidating people through their barbaric acts. They don't have any significant local support at all. There was a few ex-Baathists in Iraq who let them into Mosul without confronting them, mainly because they thought that that would teach the government in Baghdad a lesson, because the Sunnis in northwestern Iraq were so angry at the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad that they saw ISIS as a tool to use against the government in Baghdad, but then it became a monster that overwhelmed them. Also, I don't see any future for ISIS, and they're still not really challenged other than these military air attacks. Once you get credible ground forces that have to come from the region, from Iraq, from Iran, from Syria, from Turkey, from Jordan, from other places, some combination of regional armies fighting them on the ground while the West provides air support, then these guys will collapse. But if that is done without addressing any of the underlying causes that gave birth to ISIS and the previous 5-6 manifestations of Islamist political protest, then we're going to have something worse than ISIS coming down the road, because it's going to look to a lot of people, especially Sunnis, it's going to look like the West gangs up on any Sunni group, even a barbaric group like this one, that has any power in the region, and people who continue to be jobless, poor, without good medical care, with water running short, with agricultural lands drying up, with urban sprawl devastating their families, people who continue to live in conditions like this all across the Arab world, with no political rights, will keep looking for somebody to, if not help them live a better life, at least get back at the bad guys who did this to them, and they see the bad guys as the governments, and the US or Europe and Israel. And so you will continue to get radicalized, extremist, fringe criminal groups like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, emerging from this black hole of mass citizen discontent, deprivation, and humiliation across much of the Arab world. And so the solution has to be a combination of trying to see how more serious efforts can be made to address some of the underlying problems in the Arab countries. And that's very difficult. It's not easy to do. These problems have come to be over 6-7 decades of mismanagement and corruption and abuse of power. You can't turn this situation around very quickly, but you can start by having Western governments, for instance, actively working with groups in the Arab world who are trying to promote democracy, equal rights, the rule of law, independent judiciary, freedom of information, and all of the things that the majority of Arabs want, because they showed they wanted when they went out in the streets and risked their lives and are still dying to achieve those goals. It's very difficult to have a quick turnaround. This is a problem that was generated over 6 decades. It's not going to be solved in 6 months or 6 years. It's going to take some time to turn this around. But there needs to be a sense among ordinary citizens that the Western countries are not only interested in oil, are not only interested in protecting Israel, and are not only interested in protecting the Arab governments and regimes, which they did for 50, 60 years, and this is what has come. There needs to be a sense that ordinary Arab citizens feel that their rights, their aspirations, their concerns are taken into consideration, and that there is some mechanism for foreign governments to engage directly with the democratic, rule of law, peaceful aspirations of Arab citizens.
Last question. You spoke of the first-time Arab citizens are asking for their rights and freedoms. But how does that go with the spread of extremist Islam and the erosion of those freedoms?
Well, the spread of extremist Islamist movements, I wouldn't say extremist Islam. There's no such thing as extremist Islam any more than there is, extremist Christianity or Judaism. There are individuals who are following extreme ideologies and who are carrying out criminal acts in many cases. These are a natural consequence of the situation that I described. I couldn't go into a lot of details, but there's a lot of data about the problems that have been pressing on probably 250 million out of the 350 million Arabs are living in precarious conditions of economic and social and political and environmental distress. And these conditions, when they persist decade after decade, and you have the continued humiliation of the Israeli colonization of lands, of Arab lands, and the Judaization of Jerusalem, which is holy to Christians and Muslims, and foreign military attacks, wars in Iraq, and then drones, and all of these things happening together, this inevitably creates reactions by small groups of radicals that do criminal acts, like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS. The overwhelming majority of Muslims do not follow these groups. They follow mainstream groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a non-violent, nationalist-based society in each country. We may disagree with them on some of the things that they do, but these are the attraction for the majority of Arab people who want to change their societies is going to mainstream groups, many of whom are Islamist, but some of them are not. There's other kinds of groups that work in society, secular groups, human rights groups, democracy promotion, young entrepreneurs. There's all kinds of people in society trying to make things better. But the extremism is inevitable under conditions of mass deprivation, lack of rights, and continued humiliation. And the humiliation comes from three sources: domestic autocracy, Arab-Israeli issues, and Western foreign militarism. Those three, if those three continue, then we should not be surprised to see a continuation of what we've seen in the last 20, 30 years.
Thank you very much.